White Plume Mountain, an adventure originally written for first edition and then later republished and reprinted for fifth edition in the Tales from the Yawning Portal adventure book. This adventure was written by Lawrence Sheik in 1979 in an attempt to get Gary Gygax to hire him as a content writer, which worked, by the way. This adventure, which is a dungeon crawl, or more specifically, a funhouse dungeon, takes place mostly beneath White Plume Mountain, an active volcano, which in the world of Greyhawk exists roughly northeast of the city of Greyhawk itself. Which, if you're playing a Greyhawk themed adventure, is a pretty easy place to have your player characters visit, particularly with the fact that there is a new regional map around the city of Greyhawk in the new 2024 Dungeon Master Guide, which was illustrated, by the way, by Mike Sclee. Now, when you get into this adventure, the plot essentially is that the ancient wizard Caraptus has stolen three powerful artifacts from various vaults of powerful lords or adventurers: Wave, a magical trident; Whelm, a maul, or throwing hammer, which belong to the dwarves and can only be used by dwarves; and Black Razor, a great sword of incredibly chaotic origin and chaotic nature at that. These weapons, having been stolen from their owners, well, clearly the owners want them back. And being that they're extremely powerful, they will pay a fortune to get them. Some of the owners, however, if the DM wishes it, could be individuals that the player characters have to face who want to get them back by other means, such as whoever owned Black Razor beforehand was likely someone who is incredibly chaotic. Whoever purchased or owned Wave was probably someone related to the sea, or perhaps a goddess or god of the sea. Now, I've run this adventure before. I ran it in Forgotten Realms instead of Greyhawk, although I have plans to run it again in Greyhawk. And originally, when I ran it, the dwarves had a group of dwarves had Whelm and wanted it back, and that's how they were able to hire the player characters. Black Razor had been owned by a very violent, chaotic, neutral adventurer, and then Wave had been owned by the Temple of Umberlee in Baldur's Gate, who would stop at nothing to retrieve it, and also helped hire the player characters with a bounty to retrieve them. Now, how you want to set this up in your own campaign is up to you, but if you've set it in Forgotten Realms, that's one possible setup. Forgotten Realms has its own deities compared to Greyhawk, and you can switch things around. But I would suggest having the former owners of these weapons be very important in your campaign. Maybe not heavily so before the adventure or, from level one. But if you're running this as part of an ongoing campaign, you should know who these people are and where these weapons came from, as they are very, very powerful, and three powerful artifacts getting in the player's hands is going to make the player characters very, very powerful, particularly Black Razor. It is probably the most powerful weapon and greatsword in the entire game, all of 5th edition. Whelm, on the other hand, is also very powerful, but is a dwarven relic. It can only really be wielded by dwarves, so if there's no dwarf in your player's party, you don't really have to worry about it being overpowering everything. If there is, well, that dwarf in that party is going to be wielding something of tremendous power, and they're going to really enjoy using it. And I would also suggest letting them use these weapons, at least for a time. But in other words, make sure there are consequences for wielding weapons like this. Wave, I'll note, is not quite as powerful as it is a trident. It's not necessarily the ideal weapon of most player characters' choice, unlike Black Razor or maybe Whelm, which are probably a little more suited for many player characters, considering what kind of weapons they are. Wave being a trident is kind of unique, and player characters could wield it, but they might have to get creative with how they wield it, just because of it being a trident. Now, when the player characters first hear about this adventure, they likely will not be at White Plume Mountain. They will probably be in the region when they hear about the quest. White Plume Mountain does have a small village near its the base of the mountain. I don't know if it actually has an official name. You could just call it White Plume Village. There's also a small cave close to the entrance of White Plume Mountain itself called Dead Knoll Eye Socket Cave. The adventures suggest the player characters could leave their mounts in either location. And in addition, the entrance cave itself is called the Wizard's Mouth Cave. Now, there is no map of the Wizard's Mouth Cave. It's quite a small, but I would recommend that a DM should maybe create one, just because it feels like it's lacking in the adventure. If I end up running it again in 5th edition and no one has created one, I'll probably create one for myself and put it on my Patreon and give it away. But there should be some idea of where the player characters are coming from and their trek up the mountain. I think a lot of DMs have used this adventure just as a flat dungeon crawl, beginning in the very beginning. I don't recommend doing that. I recommend that the DM have the players hear about what has happened in whatever city they're in, which could be Greyhawk City, and then travel to the mountain itself, and then face the hardships of getting there, essentially, and then enter the mountain and deal with the consequences of what's inside. It's sort of like getting there is half the battle, even though it's really not that far from Greyhawk City at all, actually. They could get there reasonably quickly. Now, a note has been given to the former owners, which likely would become fairly well known by this point in the adventure. This is it's like a poem, and I'm not going to read the whole thing, but you could go on here on 5e Tools or look in the book to read it yourself. Essentially, Caraptus telling the player characters or the former owners where they can go to retrieve their items, and tempting that a group of heroes would come and find them one way or another. Now, why Caraptus has done this is anyone's guess. The idea of Caraptus is he, like Alistair Blackcloak, is an insane wizard and does bizarre things for his own nefarious purposes. Perhaps he has further plans for the player characters. I would personally go down that route if you plan on using this as a campaign and have Caraptus come back later, or have his plots and schemes continue. I will note as well, by the way, there are a couple of sequels to this adventure published in older editions. I think one is called Return to White Plume Mountain. There's also an adventure involving a false version of Caraptus. I can't remember if they're the same adventure, but there are 2 or 3 follow-ups to this adventure that take place at different time periods. The only one I've run so far is this adventure, but if I run the others down the line, I will review them as well. This mountain is also called the Feathered Mound, by the way, and is referred to that in the poem. Now, as you're running the adventure, again, it gives you a suggestion if you want to run it in different regions. They suggest putting it near or at Mount Hotanau in Forgotten Realms. I actually ran it near Parnast or Loudwater in that particular region, the December Vale. But you can place it where you want. If you don't want it in Eberron, if you don't want it in Greyhawk, you can put it in Eberron. But I would not start the player characters in the middle of the dungeon. Like I said, I would say have them approach the dungeon, have them hear about it at a distance, and have them go there and approach. It's kind of like a Lonely Mountain scenario in a lot of ways, thinking back in The Hobbit. So in The Hobbit, a big part of the adventure is getting there, like I said earlier. So have them get there and then come back again. Now, most of the dungeon that they're going to explore has 10-foot ceilings, and because what do you know? That's the standard height in a lot of dungeon crawls. An 8-foot, well, there's a cave with an 8 feet diameter and kind of standard doors and all that. And plus, there are some larger areas within the dungeon as well that are kind of unusual. I'll show you the map. That's an image from the adventure of one of the rooms. That's interesting. You can see the map here. The original adventure is kind of small. The follow-up adventures that you might want to look into are quite a lot bigger. The dungeon has been expanded. Player characters come in through this stairway here. It does not show the entrance cave, which is a 40-foot long cave. Though, like I said, if I run it again, I'll end up making one and then sharing it. The major part about this adventure is after entering, the player characters hit a wall of force, and then there's essentially a sphinx, Gynosphinx, gives them a riddle and tells them to answer it. This might be a little bit challenging. Player characters might not be used to trying to answer riddles, although I don't think it's a really hard riddle. Player characters were able to answer it rather quickly. The player characters don't necessarily have to fight the Gynosphinx, and this particular wall of force can easily be dispelled compared to others. Now, when the player characters defeat this thing or get past it, there are going to be three different passages. I'll note a lot of these locations reference something that is not easily visible. Three, for example, is a wall of slime. If you're using this map, this will give away that location. I would use a version of White Plume Mountain where that's not readily available and not visible. Same with area 10. This area in here is a more sunken area, and the player character shouldn't automatically be aware of it. This area over here, 26, is one of the more infamous areas. Is the terrarium slash aquarium room. It's just some great imagery for this. This adventure, the new version at least, has some fantastic artwork, as you saw by this map. That image I just showed you was actually room 7 with these little platforms. It's very interesting. But the other thing is, like, if you look at room 7, it shows where these like geysers of lava are. You might want the player characters not seeing that right off the bat. Otherwise, you'll just try to avoid the trap without it being a challenge at all, unless they observe what's happening, and all that. There's also some other things like Area 15, for example, is actually a huge chamber. And if you look back on an earlier map up here, see if I can find it. Here, go with this, the cutaway view of the side map. It's a huge chamber dropping down hundreds of feet. There's eventually a sort of bottom area, and then the chambers are far below that. And there's actually a tunnel exiting from there. I don't know if anyone's ever done a map for it, but it could be an extension of the adventure that the player characters could explore if the DM wanted to. The rest of this doesn't matter so much. It just gives a side view of what the mountain interior looks like. And again, the players are going to have three major choices because there's one artifact in each direction that they have to find. This area here doesn't necessarily connect between 5 and 12 and 13. It's kind of odd, but that's how it was designed. Again, it's a funhouse dungeon, being that so many rooms are so different and have nothing to do with each other. There's an awful lot of traps and just odd things here, which might throw the player characters for a loop. The adventure does point out that if the player characters are used to just hack and slash dungeons, this might be really odd for them. They're going to have to deal with some riddles and some bizarre puzzles and things like that. There is a secret door here. Obviously, this is a bad map because it's the DM's map. Because it reveals the secret doors, use a map that doesn't show that because this is the NPC access to room 24. Those who are kind of working here for Caraptus, essentially, and who are based around this area. He has some minions, in other words. So going back in the adventure itself, there is a random encounter table. I would suggest rolling the numbers of enemies ahead of time and having them, especially if you're running out on roll 20, on the map somewhere ready to go. And once you've used, for example, the bugbears, don't use bugbears again. Just say that there are so many available because that's what makes sense. And they're just roaming around the dungeon somewhere, and they're meant to slow the player characters down and cause trouble. Put them somewhere where it makes sense, of course, but there can't be an infinite number of black puddings unless Caraptus has some giant vat of black puddings somewhere that perhaps he's unleashing. It's got to make sense, despite being a funhouse dungeon. Now, as you're going further in the adventure, there is an area called the Legend of Caraptus. This was part of the original adventure. I would only use this if the player characters pass a history check to gain this information. Should be something the player characters learn right off the bat, or as soon as the adventure begins, they hear about it, have them make that history check. And if they do, read this in full. And then there's going to give them a lot of great information. As we continue, you get the different rooms, including the Riddle Guardian, the Gynosphinx, and its riddle and all that. Room 4 is 9 different spheres, some of which are trapped or have enemies in it. Some of them have treasure. It's a great funhouse dungeon room. It's really unique. I like it because it gives the players a lot of choices of what they want to interact with, and there's some fun rewards and there's some little punishments if they open the wrong thing, for example. none of which are brutally dangerous. And then you get to room 5, the numbered golems. This is a puzzle. It's not that hard, but there's a time limit. Definitely use the time limit. The golems each have a number on their forehead. They can actually talk unlike most flesh golems. And if they don't get the riddle correct and they don't answer it in 60 seconds, and I mean 60 seconds, the golems attack. And if you are DMing this adventure, don't pull any punches. I mean, if the player characters think that they're going to win every fight and they're going to walk through this, they got something else coming. Have the golems then fully attack. If the player characters answer the riddle 3 seconds too late, they took too long. Have the golems attack. However, if they answer the riddle in time, and of course, don't look up the answer to the riddle on the internet or anything, have one of the golems become their ally. And it's going to be a very, very useful asset. My player characters, one of the players figured out the puzzle and answered with its seconds to spare. Now, this is interesting if you use Undermountain as a follow up location, say later down the road, another group of adventurers comes here and the remaining golems could still be here. I did this in my adventure where the remaining golems actually asked the same question, but there wasn't, I think, golem number 5 or something like that. So the puzzle was a little more challenging. And then all of the golems attacked because those players didn't have as much information. Or sorry, I think number 9 might have been the one that came with everyone. But you can change the puzzle and the golems could still be there and they could be a dangerous threat. There's the turnstile. It's kind of just ridiculous. Here's that image earlier of crossing over room 7 with the geysers and chains. It's kind of a physical challenge unless the players are flying. There's geysers of steam, obviously. As you get here, they will eventually find Whelm. There is a vampire protecting it. It's a dangerous fight, obviously. Whelm is a very powerful weapon, especially if one of the player characters is a dwarf. Now you get Whelm's stats here. I won't go into all of them. It is actually a Warhammer. I said them all earlier, but it's a Warhammer. And thus, there's a good amount of player characters that might end up with this particular weapon and wanting to use it. I'll note these weapons might be kind of similar if you played Princess Apocalypse. It has similar weapons that are made. I think it's no coincidence. I think they made those 4 weapons to coincide with this. I think there actually is a very powerful Warhammer in that adventure as well, but that Warhammer and Whelm are like the 2 most powerful Warhammers in the game. I think it's either a Warhammer or a Warpick. It's one of the 2. But there's a similarity there for a reason. Anyways, if your group does not have a dwarf in it, don't worry. You don't need a dwarf. It could be just an item that the players recover and they get paid for. If your group happens to have a dwarf, let them keep it, at least for now. It might be the kind of thing down the line where they might lose some of these items. I won't go into detail, but my player characters made a huge mistake when it came to Wave, which got recovered by the Temple of Umberlee and was in a stone box half filled with water. And one of the player characters put the entire box into a bag of holding, which then imploded, and they lost Whelm and the box, and everything is now floating somewhere in the astral sea. Let mistakes like that happen if they do, because these are powerful weapons. If they lose one of them like that or by some mistake, it's on them. And again, they likely won't use all of them. I mentioned Wave earlier is kind of an odd weapon to use because player characters don't tend to use tridents very often, so it's probably a better item to keep. Whelm is an awesome weapon for a dwarf. Your player character will feel like a hero if they get it. If they just sell it, it's fine. And then there's Black Razor, which we'll get to. As you go through the adventure, there's some interesting chambers. There's one chamber that has like a valve as they first come into the adventure. There's mud all over the place. If they happen to drain or turn the valve, it drains after a while. I would actually suggest using 2 different maps of the adventure if you can, although I don't know if they exist. One with the water level that's descended, one where the water level is, or the mud level is its normal length. I think it's room 9 where that happens, but I could be wrong. But room 10, its depiction, I think, is, if I remember correctly, is based on how much mud is in the dungeon at the time. When it begins, the whole room is filled with mud. If the water level drops, which takes an hour, they will see what's depicted here. There are platforms all of a sudden. So having two slightly different maps, or at least of this area, is really going to come in handy, and it's going to make this dungeon feel very different and more like an interactive environment. But that's up to the DM to be able to create that and all that. There is this always amusing spinning cylinder room, which is a cylinder that just keeps spinning and it's covered in slippery oil and it's got colors and it's bizarre, but it's a funhouse dungeon for a reason. There's this little guard post. There's a werewolf here who lives here. So and plus there's a couple of actual guards. They're servants of Caraptus. I don't know if there's food here for them or whatever, but there probably should be. There should be some way that they actually live there. There's a spell book for wizards in the group, and this isn't not a terribly dangerous fight for an 8th level group. There's the boiling lake, which has a bubble in it, and there is a treasure chest. And let's just say this could be popped, and there are consequences if that happens. There is a giant crab monster, if I remember correctly, that's here. And this is also where you find Wave. You can see a picture of Wave. Show these images to your player characters if they find these weapons. This is fantastic artwork, and it definitely should be shared. Wave is a fun weapon, but again, it's not overpowered because it's a trident, and it's a weird weapon for the player characters to have. But it is an artifact. As you get further in, eventually the player characters will end up going the direction where they can eventually find Black Razor, which in my opinion is the most powerful of the 3 weapons. There's ghouls, there's some traps, there's other things. There's a strange stream the player characters can go to. There's this character Sir Bluto and his guards. He's a champion, and he's got evil knights with him, and they're servants of Caraptus. There's some hidden doors that they use, I mentioned earlier, to come and go. There is, again, this aquarium, which I find is one of the most unique and memorable rooms, although bizarre rooms in the dungeon crawl. It's odd if you're running this on roll 20 because you see where this door here, I'm kind of pointing out with my cursor. This is then the bottom of the area, and then there's a tunnel underneath it that goes to the back room where you find Black Razor. This might be a bit odd if you're running it on roll 20. I would find a map, for example, that doesn't have this little back area because it's not on the same level as this platform here. It's actually below it. It's better to have a room like this and the player characters just see the door down there and have to figure it out. And then on the side, have a little tunnel in the back room. And that will work better if you're running it on a virtual tabletop. They could try to break the glass, but of course there's a wall of force that can activate to block the water from flowing out. Player characters will likely just have to figure out how to deal with these creatures, which can attack from the water. They could try just using the doorway in a distance, but the angle of approach should make things difficult. The player characters probably aren't going to be able to go far back in the tunnel and fire down into the tunnel unless they're dropping like a fireball, just because there's going to be some weird angles in play. And if they want to be able to target these things with like ranged attacks, they're going to have to be close to the door. And even from there, the enemies in there are probably going to have partial or 3/4 cover if you think about just the weird angles involved here and what they'll be able to see just from the doorway. Also, just because these are aquatic creatures doesn't mean they necessarily can't leave their enclosures if they're attacked. It could be interesting if they do, or say they crawl up on land or something like that. Some of these creatures could do that. It shouldn't just be player characters shooting from a distance and killing things for XP. These things might come out of where they are. Now, finally, you'll get to Black Razor itself. This is a very powerful weapon, and like I said, it's probably the most powerful great axe in the game. It will literally destroy someone's soul and turn that soul into temporary hit points at its maximum value, unless they've changed it here, which I don't think they have. It's absolutely ridiculously powerful if the players get a hold of it. I would suggest that the player's characters get any of these weapons, which they likely will. The weapons are intelligent, they have personalities. Those personalities should come into play. Wilm has a very different personality than Wave. Black Razor is a weapon of chaos and wants to destroy things. If the player characters wield Whelm, they're likely going to feel its influence and its willingness to destroy souls, and it's going to affect the campaign, and it's going to affect how the player characters will continue. One of my player characters was a halfling paladin who got a hold of Black Razor and awkwardly wielded it, and then came to the conclusion on her own that she needed to find a different volcano and to throw it in a volcano in a very ironic storyline, which they never did complete. But that was the goal. Whelm is very destructive, and again, it's be wary of this. The player characters might go nuts with this weapon. If if it was taken from somebody, that somebody should be someone very powerful who will stop at nothing to get it back. Imagine like a murder hobo player character who got his weapon stolen and will do anything to get his weapon of utter chaos and destruction back. That's the kind of enemy the player character should have to deal with as a consequence for taking this weapon and wielding it. Anyways, as you're going through the adventure, in the very end, player characters will have to leave, and the real kind of twist here is the boss fight. There's a wall of force at the beginning. It could be thrown up there to block them at first, and then the player characters will have to fight two Ifritis, which, depending on what edition you're using, the Ifritis could summon fire elementals against the player characters. This should be a very a surprise fight and a very dangerous fight. One of my high level player characters came into the adventure after it was originally explored, did not know these creatures were here, and had to fight them. And this very high level character was essentially destroyed, horribly mutilated, and captured, and then brainwashed by Caraptus. And apparently, in my campaign, is now spending his days wandering around this dungeon, trapped, killing random adventurers that show up. Anyways, you can run it how you like. These are just ideas. Overall, White Plume Mountain kind of has a bad reputation for being a funhouse dungeon. Some player characters or DMs back in the day kind of think it's too ridiculous to use, and it gives too many overpowered weapons. Player characters tend to love this adventure because it's so bizarre and all over the place, and it gives some huge rewards. Although again, big rewards come with big consequences. Overall, I honestly think it's a near perfect adventure. It's unique, but there's only some minor flaws with, say, some of how the dungeon is set up, not showing you the entrance, for example, or not giving you much of an approach map of the area. Although there's some really good maps online you can find of the local area in Greyhawk. If you really search for them, trust me, they're out there. And most of the issues I might have with this adventure personally, I think can be solved with just consequence. Like if they get Black Razor, there should be consequences for it. If you want to do the opening cavern, which doesn't really have any monsters in it, it could be easily created and solving that little problem. So as a result, I would rate this adventure a 5-star adventure out of 5 stars. Now, guys, if you like my reviews and want to see more of them, please like this review and subscribe for more content.